McDonald's manager Karen fires an employee for giving leftover food to homeless kids without knowing who was watching. The old lighthouse stood like a sentinel at the edge of Meridian Cove, its weathered exterior bearing the scars of 100 winters. For most of the town's residents, it was simply a landmark, a postcard image to be admired from a distance. But for Emma West, it was both sanctuary and prison, the place where her life had fractured 12 years ago, and the only place she could now find any semblance of peace. At 42, Emma had the sturdy build of someone accustomed to physical labor, though the slight stoop of her shoulders suggested a weight carried far heavier than any lumber or stone. Her most distinctive feature was a scar that ran from her right temple to just below her cheekbone, a permanent reminder of the night that had changed everything. Her dark eyes, once described as lively by those who knew her before, now held a vigilant wariness, as though perpetually scanning the horizon for approaching storms. This particular morning found her where she was most days, in the lighthouse, keeper's cottage that had been converted into a small maritime museum. As the curator, Emma spent her days cataloguing artifacts, giving occasional tours to the handful of visitors who made the trek to this remote corner of Massachusetts, and tending to the maintenance of both buildings. It was a solitary existence, punctuated only by brief interactions with tourists and monthly meetings with the Historical Society Board. "Em, did you finish the inventory for the new exhibit?" The voice belonged to Sophia Chen, the only person in town who still called her by her childhood nickname. At 38, Sophia served as both the town librarian and the president of the Historical Society. Her petite frame belied a formidable energy, and her quick analytical mind was evident in the sharp intelligence of her gaze. Today, her long black hair was swept into a practical bun, and she wore the perpetually distracted expression of someone with too many responsibilities. "Almost," Emma replied, not looking up from the logbook she was examining. "Just need to authenticate a few more items." Sophia sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "The board is getting antsy. The summer season starts in 3 weeks, and they're hoping this exhibit will finally put us on the map." The unspoken weight of financial pressure hung between them. The museum operated on a threadbare budget, and everyone knew this summer would determine whether it survived another year. "It'll be ready," Emma said, finally meeting her gaze. "I promised, didn't I?" A small smile softened Sophia's features. "You did, and unlike some people in this town, your promises still mean something." Before Emma could respond, the distant sound of a car door slamming caught their attention. Visitors were rare this early in the season, especially on a Tuesday morning. "Were you expecting anyone?" Sophia asked, moving toward the window. Emma shook her head, a familiar uneasiness settling in her chest. She had learned long ago that unexpected arrivals rarely brought good news to Meridian Cove. As she joined Sophia at the window, her breath caught at the sight of the woman emerging from the sleek rental car. Even after all these years, she would recognize Meredith Sullivan anywhere. Meredith stood at the base of the lighthouse, her gaze fixed upward, as though measuring its height against her memory. At 39, she carried herself with the confident poise that came from years navigating the high-pressure world of investigative journalism. Her copper-red hair, once long and often wild in the coastal wind, was now cut in a sophisticated bob that framed her face. She wore dark jeans and a simple white blouse under a light jacket, casual enough for the small coastal town, but still bearing the unmistakable polish of someone who had left such places behind. What most people noticed first about Meredith, however, wasn't her appearance but her voice, low and melodic with a hint of huskiness that commanded attention without seeming to try. It was a voice made for uncovering truths, for asking the questions others avoided, and it had carried her far from the shores of Meridian Cove to a prestigious position at the Boston Globe. Now that voice was silent as she studied the lighthouse, unaware of the eyes watching her from the cottage window. In her hand, she clutched a worn leather journal, the catalyst for her return after 12 years of deliberate absence. Inside the cottage, Emma had gone very still. "Is that who I think it is?" Sophia whispered, though there was no one else to hear them. Emma nodded once, her expression unreadable. Meredith Sullivan. After all this time. Sophia's voice trailed off, laden with unspoken history. She turned to face Emma. "Do you want me to get rid of her?" The offer, made with fierce loyalty, almost brought a smile to Emma's face. 5'2" Sophia, ready to battle anyone who might cause her pain. "No," she said after a long moment. "I'll talk to her." Sophia looked unconvinced. "Are you sure? No one would blame you if—" "I'm sure." Her tone left no room for argument, though her clenched jaw told a different story. As Emma stepped outside, the familiar scent of salt and pine enveloped her, the unchanging backdrop to the many scenes of her life that had played out here. Meredith hadn't noticed her yet, still absorbed in her contemplation of the lighthouse. "It's shorter than I remember," she said without turning, proving she had sensed her presence after all. "Things from our past often are," Emma replied, stopping, several feet away from her. Meredith turned then, and something flickered across her face when she saw her. Recognition, regret, or perhaps both. Her gaze caught on the scar briefly before rising to meet her eyes. "Hello, Emma?" "Meredith." She nodded slightly. "What brings you back to Meridian Cove?" She hesitated, glancing down at the journal in her hands. "I'm working on a story about what happened here." The simple statement landed like a physical blow. Emma's expression hardened. "It's been 12 years. Why now?" "Because I think we got it wrong," Meredith said quietly. "All of us, including me." Before Emma could respond, the cottage door opened and Sophia emerged, her protective instincts evidently overriding her promise to stay inside. "Meredith Sullivan," she said, walking over to stand beside Emma. "This is unexpected." "Sophia." Meredith offered a smile that wasn't returned. "It's good to see you." "Wish I could say the same," Sophia replied coolly. "Last time you were here, you left quite a mess behind you." Meredith's composure slipped for just a moment. "I know, and I'm sorry for that, but this is important." "Important for whom?" Emma asked. "Your career? Another award-winning exposé?" "For the truth," Meredith said, meeting her gaze steadily. "And maybe for Snoop's memory." At the mention of her brother's name, Emma's carefully constructed walls threatened to crumble. Snoop West, her younger brother by 2 years, the town's golden boy and Meredith's fiancé, until the night he disappeared from the lighthouse 12 years ago, his body washing ashore 3 days later. "Snoop's memory doesn't need your help," Emma said through clenched teeth. "And neither do I." Meredith held up the journal. "This belonged to him. I found it last month when I was cleaning out my mother's attic." She hesitated. "There are things in here, Emma. Things that don't match what we all believed happened." "What's she talking about?" Sophia asked, looking between them. But Emma had already turned away, heading back toward the cottage with long strides. "Whatever you're selling, Meredith, I'm not buying. Go back to Boston." "Your brother didn't kill himself," Meredith called after her, her voice carrying in the coastal air. "And I think you've known that all along." Emma froze, one hand on the cottage door. Without turning, she said, "You have 5 minutes inside, then you leave and don't come back." The small cottage office felt even smaller with the 3 of them inside. Emma stood by the window, arms crossed, while Sophia perched protectively on the edge of her desk. Meredith sat in the visitor's chair, the journal open on her lap. "Start talking," Emma said. Meredith nodded, her reporter's instincts clearly warring with the emotion of the moment. 3 weeks ago, I was helping my mother pack for her move to Florida. In the attic, I found a box of things I'd left behind when She paused. "When I left Meridian Cove, this was inside." She handed the journal to Emma, who took it reluctantly. The leather was worn smooth from handling, the pages dog-eared and filled with Snoop's distinctive handwriting, neat but cramped, as though he was always trying to fit more words than the paper could hold. "I didn't know he kept a journal," Emma said quietly. "Neither did I," Meredith replied. "At least, not until we were engaged. He said it helped him make sense of things." She leaned forward slightly, turned to the entry dated April 18th, 12 years ago. Emma flipped through the pages until she found the date, just 2 weeks before Snoop's death. She began to read, her expression growing increasingly troubled. When she finished, she looked up at Meredith, her face pale. "This can't be right." "What is it?" Sophia asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Emma handed her the journal, her hand slightly unsteady. Snoop was investigating the town council, specifically Harrison Wells and his development plans for the North Shore. Sophia's eyes widened as she scanned the page. He thought they were taking bribes to push through environmental permits. "And not just any developers," Meredith added. "Coastal Vista Properties, owned by the Whitmore family." The name hung in the air, like a thundercloud. Victoria Whitmore was now the mayor of Meridian Cove, her family's influence having grown exponentially over the past decade. What had once been a modest real estate company was now the driving economic force behind the town's recent prosperity. Prosperity that had never quite reached the lighthouse or its museum. Snoop confronted them, Emma said slowly, the pieces clicking into place. "That's why he asked me to meet him at the lighthouse that night. He said he had something important to tell me." Her voice grew hoarse. "But when I got there, he was already gone," Meredith finished softly. "And 3 days later they found his body and everyone assumed that he jumped," Sophia whispered, horror dawning on her face. "But if these allegations in his journal are true, then someone might have wanted to silence him," Emma said, the implication landing heavily in the room. Meredith nodded grimly. "And they let you take the blame. The troubled older sister who couldn't save him, who was the last person to see him alive." The accusation had never been stated explicitly, but it had lingered in the town's collective consciousness, in the sidelong glances and hushed conversations that stopped when Emma entered a room. Why hadn't she prevented it? What had they argued about that night? The questions remained unasked but ever present, driving Emma further into isolation until only the lighthouse remained. "This is all speculation," Sophia said, ever the pragmatist despite her obvious distress. "Snoop's journal proves he was investigating something, but it doesn't prove he was murdered." "You're right," Meredith acknowledged. "That's why I'm here. I need access to Snoop's things, anything he might have left behind that could corroborate what's in the journal." Emma's laugh was hollow. "After 12 years, the police took most of his papers as part of their investigation." "But not everything," Meredith pressed. "Snoop was methodical. He would have kept backups, insurance." She hesitated. "Did he leave anything with you? Something for safekeeping, perhaps?" Emma was about to deny it when a memory surfaced. Snoop, 2 days before his death, stopping by the cottage with a sealed envelope. "Just hang on to this for me, Em. Professional stuff, boring legal documents." The casual way he'd said it, so deliberate in its nonchalance. The envelope had sat in Emma's desk drawer for years, unopened, eventually migrating to a box of Snoop's. Personal effects that she couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't bring herself to discard. "Maybe," she said slowly. "I need to check." As Emma left to search the storage room, Sophia fixed Meredith with a penetrating stare. "Why now, Meredith? After all this time, why come back and stir up these ghosts?" Meredith met her gaze unflinchingly. "Because I owe it to Snoop, and to Emma." She glanced toward the doorway through which she had disappeared. "I abandoned them both 12 years ago, Snoop to his grave and Emma to this. Half-life she's been living." "You're not the only one with regrets," Sophia said, her voice softening slightly. "But be careful. If there's any truth to this, you're poking a very powerful bear." Meredith's expression hardened with resolve. "Not my first dangerous story. Won't be my last." "This isn't just a story," Sophia countered. "This is Emma's life. What happens when you finish your exposé and go back to Boston? She'll still be here dealing with the fallout." Before Meredith could respond, Emma returned carrying a dusty cardboard box. She set it on the desk and removed the lid, revealing a collection of Snoop's possessions, books, a baseball cap, a framed photograph of Snoop and Meredith on the beach, and at the bottom a sealed manila envelope with Emma's name scrawled across the front. "This is it," she said, picking up the envelope. It felt substantial in her hands, weighted with more than just paper. After a moment's hesitation, she broke the seal and tipped the contents onto the desk. What spilled out was more than any of them had expected. A USB drive, a small notebook filled with dates and amounts and photographs, grainy but clear enough to show Harrison Wells accepting an envelope from a woman they all recognized as Victoria Whitmore's mother, the late T.F. Catherine Whitmore. But it was the final item that drew their collective breath, a silver pocket watch, distinctive for the compass inlaid in its cover. Catherine Whitmore's prized possession, rumored to have been passed down through generations of her family. "Why would Snoop have this?" Sophia asked, voicing what they were all wondering. Meredith reached for the notebook, flipping through its pages. "These are records of meetings, payments." She looked up, eyes wide. "This is everything he would have needed to prove the corruption." "And the watch?" Emma picked it up, turning it over in her hand. The back was engraved with the Whitmore family crest. A heavy silence fell as the implication became clear. If Snoop had taken or been given Catherine Whitmore's watch, it suggested a confrontation or exchange none of them had known about. "Snoop wasn't just investigating from a distance," Meredith said slowly. "He was directly involved with the Whitmores somehow." Emma's mind raced back to those final days before Snoop's death. Her brother had been distant, preoccupied, begging off their usual Sunday dinners with vague excuses about work. Emma had attributed it to wedding stress, to Snoop's natural tendency to become absorbed in his projects. Never once had she imagined something like this. If the Whitmores realized what Snoop knew, she couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. "Then we need to be extremely careful how we proceed," Meredith said, her journalist's mind already mapping out the investigation. "This is bigger than just Snoop now. If the entire town council was corrupted 12 years ago, then what does that mean for everything that's happened since?" Sophia finished, the implications dawning on her face. "The rezoning of the wetlands, the tourism development contracts, the new harbor." She looked at Emma. "Even the pressure on the Lighthouse Museum to modernize or move." The three exchanged glances, the weight of the past and present colliding in the small room. After 12 years of believing she had failed to save her brother from himself, Emma now faced a different, more insidious possibility: that Snoop had been killed for what he knew, and that those responsible had not only escaped justice but had thrived, building their success on the foundation of that crime. "I need to take this to my editor," Meredith said, already reaching for her phone. Emma's hand shot out, catching her wrist. "No." Meredith looked up, startled. "Emma, this is evidence of nothing definitive," she interrupted, her voice low and intense. "And the moment you take this public, we lose any advantage of surprise." Her grip tightened slightly. "I've lived with my brother's ghost for 12 years, Meredith. I won't let his killer slip away because we moved too fast." Their eyes locked. In a silent battle of wills, the familiar tension between them resurfacing. It had always been this way. Meredith rushing toward truth regardless of consequences. Emma methodical, considering all angles before acting. "What do you suggest, then?" she asked finally. Emma released her wrist and straightened. For the first time since she arrived, she seemed fully present, the fog of grief momentarily lifted by purpose. "We investigate," she said simply. "Together. Before we take this to anyone else, we need to know exactly what happened the night Snoop died." She looked between Meredith and Sophia. "Are you with me?" Sophia nodded without hesitation. "Always have been, Em." Meredith's response came more slowly, weighted with the recognition of what she was committing to. Not just a story now, but a reckoning with her own past and the choices she had made. "I'm with you," she said finally, "for Snoop and for the truth." Outside, the lighthouse cast its long shadow across the cottage as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon. Within those shadows, the three unlikely allies began to formulate a plan to unearth a truth long buried, unaware that, in doing so, they were setting in motion events that would change Meridian Cove forever. The Whitmore Foundation's annual gala was in full swing by the time Emma, Meredith, and Sophia arrived. The yacht club glittered with string lights, the town's elite mingling on the deck overlooking the harbor. After 2 weeks of careful investigation, tracking down former council members, piecing together the paper trail of the development deals, and confirming the authenticity of Snoop's evidence, they had decided that confronting Victoria Whitmore directly was their next step. The plan was simple. Meredith, with her press credentials, would engage Victoria in conversation about her family's legacy while wearing a discreet recording device. Sophia would circulate, keeping tabs on Harrison Wells and other key players from the original council. Emma, whose face was too well known and whose presence would immediately raise suspicion, would monitor from a distance, positioned to intervene, if necessary. What none of them had anticipated was the visceral effect of seeing Victoria Whitmore in person. At 52, she radiated the easy confidence of a woman who had never faced consequences for her actions. Her silver-streaked hair and tailored suit spoke of wealth, but it was the familiar pocket watch chain visible at her vest that sent a chill through Emma. Catherine Whitmore's watch, or one identical to it, not lost as they had speculated, but passed down to her daughter. "Stay focused," Sophia murmured as she passed by Emma, noting her fixation. "We stick to the plan." Emma nodded, forcing herself to look away. Across the room, Meredith was already making her approach, smartphone in hand, as though preparing to take notes for a flattering profile piece. She watched as she smiled, extended her hand to Victoria, and was welcomed into her circle with the practiced charm of a politician. For 20 minutes, everything proceeded exactly as they had hoped. Meredith skillfully guided the conversation toward Victoria's mother and her early development vision for Meridian Cove. From her vantage point, Emma could see Harrison Wells growing increasingly uncomfortable as the discussion veered toward specific projects from 12 years ago. It was only when Meredith casually mentioned Snoop's name that the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Victoria's smile remained fixed, but something cold entered her eyes, a calculation that set alarm bells ringing in Emma's mind. "Snoop West," Victoria said, her voice carrying just far enough for Emma to hear. "That was a tragedy. I remember my mother was quite disturbed by it." She paused, taking a sip of her champagne. "You were engaged to him, weren't you, Ms. Sullivan? Strange that you would return to write about our little town after all this time." The implied question hung in the air between them. Meredith held her ground admirably, but Emma could see that Victoria was no longer playing along with the pretense of a puff piece. "Tragedies have a way of staying with us," Meredith replied carefully. "Especially when questions remain unanswered." Victoria's gaze sharpened. What questions could possibly remain after all this time? The police investigation was quite thorough. "Was it?" Meredith countered. "They never found a suicide note. And Snoop had just received a promotion at work, was engaged to be married. Not exactly the profile of someone planning to end his life." The conversation had drawn the attention of others nearby, including Harrison Wells, who had drifted closer with a concerned expression. Emma tensed, ready to intervene. This was escalating too quickly, moving beyond their careful script into dangerous territory. "Perhaps you didn't know him as well as you thought," Victoria suggested, her tone deceptively gentle but her eyes hard as flint. She glanced around as though suddenly aware of their audience. "But this is hardly the venue for such a morbid discussion. Why don't we continue this in private? My office has a lovely view of the harbor." Meredith hesitated, clearly recognizing both the opportunity and the risk. They had hoped to extract information subtly, not confront Victoria directly. At least not yet, not before they had gathered more concrete evidence. Emma shook her head slightly, trying to catch her eye, but she had already made her decision. "I'd appreciate that," she said, accepting the invitation with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. As Victoria placed a hand on Meredith's elbow to guide her toward the exit, Emma abandoned her position and made her way quickly to Sophia. "She's isolating her," she said under her breath. "Get the car and be ready, I'm going after them." Sophia nodded, understanding immediately the unspoken concern. "Be careful, Em, if we're right about her." "I know." Emma squeezed her arm briefly before threading her way through the crowd toward the exit. Outside, the night air was sharp with the scent of the sea and the approaching storm. Emma spotted Victoria and Meredith walking toward the marina office, a stone building set apart from the yacht club. The isolation of the location sent another surge of alarm through her. This was wrong, all wrong. They were moving too fast without proper preparation or backup. She followed at a distance using the shadows of boats and equipment for cover. As Victoria unlocked the office door and held it open for Meredith, Emma made a split-second decision. Rather than following them inside directly, she circled around to the back of the building, where a narrow wooden walkway ran along the water's edge. If memory served, the harbourmaster's office had a rear entrance and windows overlooking the bay. The walkway creaked beneath her weight as she moved carefully toward the back of the building. Through the window, she could see Meredith and Victoria, their body language tense. Victoria was speaking, her back partly turned, while Meredith stood rigidly by the desk, her hand in her pocket where Emma knew the recording device was concealed. A flash of movement to her right caught Emma's attention. Harrison Wells was approaching along the main dock, his pace purposeful. Emma ducked lower, pressing herself against the weathered wood of the building. This hadn't been part of their calculations. Wells following them, potentially trapping Meredith between two people who might have been involved in Snoop's death. Inside, Victoria's voice had risen enough to carry through the partially open window. Becoming a nuisance, just like your fiancé was. Snoop couldn't leave well enough alone. Either always digging, always self-righteous about his journalistic integrity. So you did know what he was investigating, Meredith replied, her voice steady despite the clear threat in Victoria's words. Of course I knew, Victoria scoffed. My mother told me everything. Snoop came to her with his evidence, trying to play hero, threatening to expose the whole operation unless we halted the development. Her laugh was bitter, as if one idealistic reporter could stop progress. This town was dying before we stepped in. And that justified murder? Meredith asked bluntly, abandoning all pretense. Emma froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was pushing too hard, too fast. Victoria's face darkened. No one said anything about murder. Snoop West killed himself. Ask his sister. She was there that night. Emma arrived after Snoop had already fallen, Meredith countered. Or was. Pushed. Be very careful with your accusations, Ms. Sullivan. Victoria's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. People who chase ghosts often become them. The door to the office opened, and Harrison Wells stepped inside. Emma tensed, preparing to intervene. She couldn't hear what Wells said, but the older man's expression was grave, his gesture toward Meredith unmistakably hostile. Emma had seen enough. She moved swiftly to the rear door, testing the handle. Locked. With no other option, she used her elbow to break the glass pane in the door, reached through the jagged opening and unlocked it from the inside. The sound of breaking glass alerted those within. As Emma pushed through the door, she found herself face to face with Victoria Whitmore, whose surprised expression quickly hardened into contempt. Emma West, she said, as though the name itself was distasteful. Joining the family reunion? Your brother's memory seems to be drawing quite a crowd tonight. Step away from her, Emma said, ignoring the barb. Her gaze moved to Meredith, checking for any sign of harm. She appeared shaken but uninjured, her hand still in her pocket. Harrison. Wells moved to position himself between Emma and the exit. This is a private conversation, West. Nobody invited you. Actually, I did, Meredith said, withdrawing her hand from her pocket, not with the recording device they had planned, but with Snoop's journal. I thought it was time we all discussed what really happened the night Snoop died. The sight of the journal caused a visible reaction in both Victoria and Wells. Wells' face drained of color, while Victoria's expression became calculating. Where did you get that? Wells demanded. Does it matter? Emma countered, stepping further into the room. What matters is what's in it. Names, dates, amounts. Everything Snoop knew about your corruption. She turned to Victoria. Including your mother's role in all of it. My mother built this town, Victoria snapped, her composure cracking, while people like your brother tried to tear it down with their self-righteous crusades. Snoop wasn't trying to tear anything down, Meredith said. He was trying to protect the coastline, the people who live here. He believed in Meridian Cove. Believed, Victoria repeated with a sneer, past tense, because belief doesn't change reality. And the reality is, development happens, progress marches on, and sometimes people who stand in the way get hurt. The admission hung in the air, not explicit but unmistakable. "What happened that night?" Emma asked, her voice low and intense. "I need to know." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the increasing patter of rain on the roof as the storm moved in from the sea. Then, surprisingly, it was Harrison Wells who broke the silence. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he said, his voice suddenly tired, the weight of 12 years visible in his slumped shoulders. "Catherine just wanted to talk to him, to reason with him. I was supposed to keep watch outside the lighthouse." "Harry," Victoria warned, but Wells shook his head. "I'm tired, Vic. Tired of carrying this. Tired of seeing his face every time I close my eyes." He looked at Emma. "Your brother wouldn't back down. Catherine lost her temper. She was like that, you remember, quick to anger. She pushed Snoop just once, but it was enough, near the railing," his voice faltered. "You watched my brother fall and did nothing," Emma said, the words barely audible through the roaring in her ears. "I wasn't there for that part," Wells insisted. "I was outside, but I heard Catherine afterward panicking. We agreed to make it look like a suicide. The watch, Snoop had taken it as evidence earlier that day. Catherine was desperate to find it. So you let everyone believe Emma was the last person to see Snoop alive," Meredith said, disgust evident in her voice. "You let her carry that burden while you built your careers and fortunes on Snoop's death." Victoria's expression had grown increasingly cornered as Wells spoke. Now she moved suddenly, lunging past Emma toward the rear door. Without thinking, Emma grabbed her fist connecting with Victoria's jaw in a blow fueled by 12 years of grief and rage. Victoria staggered back, colliding with the desk. "My mother is dead," she spat, blood trickling from her split lip. "Nothing you do now can touch her." "But it can touch you," Meredith said, finally revealing the recording device in her other hand. "Every word, Victoria. Your implied confession, Harrison's explicit one. It's all here." The color drained from Victoria's face as she realized the trap she had walked into. Outside, the sound of sirens cut through the storm. Sophia, true to her word, had called for backup when too much time had passed without contact. As the room filled with police officers, Emma found herself strangely calm. The truth wouldn't bring Snoop back, but it would free her from the shadow that had defined her life for over a decade. She watched as Victoria and Wells were led away, their protests falling on deaf ears in the face of the recorded evidence. In the sudden quiet following their departure, Emma turned to Meredith, who stood clutching Snoop's journal to her chest like a shield. "It's over," she said softly. Emma shook her head, rain from her hair scattering in droplets that caught the harsh office light. "Not yet, but it's beginning to be." 6 months later, Emma stood on the observation deck of the lighthouse, watching as the autumn sun cast long shadows across Meridian Cove. Below, workers were completing the new boardwalk that would connect the Lighthouse Museum to the town's waterfront path, the first phase of a revised development plan that prioritized public access and environmental protection over luxury condominiums. The trial of Victoria Whitmore and Harrison Wells had dominated regional news throughout the summer, bringing to light not only Snoop's death, but a decade of corruption that had followed. The revelations had initially shaken the town to its core, dividing residents between those who defended the economic growth the Whitmores had brought and those who demanded accountability. In the end, justice had prevailed, if imperfectly. Both had been convicted, Wells for his role in covering up Snoop's death, Victoria for the years of corruption that followed and her attempt to threaten Meredith. Catherine Whitmore's role in Snoop's actual death remained technically unproven, though few in town doubted Wells' account after all the evidence came to light. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Meredith's voice pulled Emma from her contemplation. She joined her at the railing, her gaze following hers out to sea. "Just thinking about how much has changed," she replied, "and how much hasn't." Meredith nodded, understanding what she left unsaid. Snoop was still gone. The scar on Emma's face hadn't faded. The years of isolation couldn't be reclaimed. Yet something had shifted within her. A weight lifted, allowing her to stand straighter, to breathe more deeply. The museum board approved. The new exhibit, Meredith said after a comfortable silence. Snoop's investigation, his journals, the environmental impact studies he compiled, all of it will be on permanent display. He would have hated that, Emma said with a small smile. Being memorialized. He always said journalists should report the story, not become it. True, but sometimes the story finds you anyway. Meredith's hand found hers on the railing, hesitant at first, then more certain when she didn't pull away. Have you decided about the job offer? The Meridian Cove Historical Society, Flush, with new funding and public interest following the trial, had offered Emma the position of executive director, not just of the Lighthouse Museum, but of all the town's historical properties. It was an opportunity to reshape the narrative of the place that had both broken and sustained her. I'm going to take it, she said, the decision feeling right as she spoke it aloud. Someone needs to make sure this town remembers its past honestly, the good and the bad. Meredith's smile was warm. Snoop would be proud. Of both of us, I think. Her series about the case had earned her a Pulitzer nomination, but more significantly, it had led to her decision to leave the Boston Globe for a position with a nonprofit, investigative journalism outfit, one that focused on environmental corruption in small coastal communities. Her new base of operations would be just 30 minutes from Meridian Cove. Will you stay for dinner? Emma asked, turning to face her fully. Sophia's coming over. Something about celebrating new beginnings. The invitation hung between them. Weighted with possibilities, neither was quite ready to name, but both were beginning to acknowledge. I'd like that, Meredith said simply. As they descended the spiral staircase of the lighthouse together, Emma felt Snoop's presence, not as a ghost to be appeased or a tragedy to be. Mourned, but as a brother whose legacy she could finally honor. The weight of echoes from the past still lingered, but now they carried whispers of justice rather than accusation. Outside, the setting sun painted the cove in shades of amber and gold, the same colors that had bathed these shores for centuries before the Whitmores, and would continue long after their names faded from memory. The lighthouse would remain, though, steadfast in its purpose, not just guiding ships safely home, but now standing as a monument to the power of truth, even when delayed. Emma paused for a moment at the base of the lighthouse, glancing back up at its weathered tower. For the first time in 12 years, it felt less like a prison, and more like what it had always meant to be, a beacon of light, cutting through darkness, showing the way forward. Ready? Meredith asked, waiting a few steps ahead. Emma nodded, turning away from the past and toward whatever future lay waiting beyond the shadows. Yes, she said, I think I finally am.